Welcome to Doc Secret, the show where we uncover the playbooks, strategies, and stories behind the most successful dental and medical practice owners and the companies that serve them. This show is all about building the best practice. Whether you're a dental or medical student dreaming of private practice, a seasoned doctor looking to grow or sell, or an investor exploring the healthcare space, this podcast is for you. I'm your host, Kevin Carl, and in today's episode, we're diving into building strength and resilience through couples and family therapy. Let's get started. Welcome to Doc Secret. Today on Doc Secret, we're honored to welcome Chase Butala, a licensed professional counselor and seasoned psychotherapist with more than 2 decades of experience helping individuals, couples, and families navigate life's most challenging emotional and relational issues. Chase earned his bachelor's degree in sociology from Shippensburg University and his master's in rehabilitation counseling from West Virginia University, grounding his clinical practice in both human behavior and evidence-based therapeutic models. He's worked across settings, from adolescent treatment programs in residential behavioral health to leadership roles directing mental health services within public safety systems, giving him deep insight into the patterns that shape human connection and conflict. Chase is also the founder of Undefeated Healthcare, a practice dedicated to empowering clients to break through barriers, build resilience, and cultivate meaningful relationships through personalized, strength-based therapy. His approach blends modalities like CBT, internal family systems, and trauma-informed care to meet clients where they are and help them grow into their best selves. Today, we'll explore how Chase's journey informed his work with couples and families, what truly helps relationships heal, and why leaning into vulnerability can become a source of strength. Chase, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me, Kevin.
Well, Chase, let's start here. You've described therapy as strength training for the mind and soul, and you named your private practice Undefeated Healthcare. What's the story behind that name, and when in your own life did Undefeated stop being a slogan and start being a mission?
So, the mission has always been there way before the name was, but the mission's all about adversity. I've had adversity in my life. I've had loss. I've had challenges. I've had difficult relationships. And through that adversity, I've learned a lot about myself. And so, what I've come to learn is that adversity is a wonderful thing. It helps you confront your stuff. It gives you the opportunity to tune in and to listen to what the world's telling you, to what other people are telling you about your habits and your patterns. And it gives you the opportunity to grow and heal. That's what Undefeated Healthcare is about. Undefeated Healthcare is about helping people get attuned with that adversity, see it as a place to grow from, and then to set a new standard for them to live their lives by and to live at a higher quality moving forward.
Well, that's great. For somebody listening who doesn't know you yet, how do you describe what you do today and who Undefeated Healthcare is really built for? For example, is it couples, parents, executives, individuals? Tell us about that.
That's a great question. So, Undefeated Healthcare is therapy services. And what we do is we work with individuals, couples, and families, all to help them improve the level of strength in their lives. It's for individuals looking to fill up their cup, to see how well they're actually functioning. It's for parents, family members that want to feel more security, that they're actually leading a strong family. Or it's for couples that want to feel more certainty in their relationship, certainty that only comes from having a relationship that's full of good intimacy and vulnerability and depth.
Wow. Sounds like it could impact a wide range of people. Uh, I want to take us back for a minute, Chase. What first pulled you towards mental health work? You mentioned challenges that you've had in your life. Was there a moment in college or early adulthood when you realized I want to sit, with people in the hard stuff and do that for a living?
So when I was in my undergrad, I did an internship at a residential treatment center outside of Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. And it was a military style placement. kids from the inner city of Philly and Pittsburgh. And these were super tough kids. And I didn't have a whole lot in common with them, being from suburbia myself. And these kids were super rough. They were really tough to connect with. And they did this thing called a sweat lodge. And I don't know if you've ever heard of a sweat lodge, but what a sweat lodge is, it's you go inside of a large teepee that's shaped like a buffalo, and you bring in sacred rocks that have been heated in a fire all day. And then you pour water on top of them to create steam. And you do therapeutic work under the pressure of the steam. And it was amazing. I remember the first time I did it to go in and experience the sweat lodge and see that just what the steam did to shed the layers these kids had and to watch the healers go in and work the magic with these kiddos. And I knew right then that I wanted to be a part of that healing process and to get good and to lead in the way these people were.
Wow, that sounds amazing, and I'm sure there are a lot of kids that have benefited from that, and I know there are a lot of kids in our society that could benefit from that type of, as you referred to, shedding of layers. I know you've been in this field for more than 20 years. You've had formal postgraduate training at West Virginia University, and I know you've worked across multiple levels of care. What parts of your training or early supervision most shaped how you practice today?
Well, I was really fortunate to get connected with great facilities that had great clinical modalities. The first thing I think I've learned a ton about working in inpatient settings, from residential treatment to inpatient psych to prison setting, is about trauma informed care. Well, over 95% of the individuals I've gotten to work with in those settings have had some level of trauma going on. And so it's given me an immense understanding of what trauma behavior is, what trauma responses are, and different types of interventions that are helpful for them. I think I've learned a lot about crisis management, learning how to be somebody that manages crisis well individually and managing myself in a crisis, and then looking to teach that to parents or couples moving forward on how to manage conflict situations better. And then lastly is behavior modification. Behavior mod is always there. It's always available for people, and learning how to be a variable and move around different aspects of a person's life is super useful. And it's useful today working with couples because everybody's working on setting boundaries and standards. And that's really what behavior mod is that boundary work.
Well, we're going to come back and dive into that in some detail. I want to touch on something you just said. You've worked in a variety of inpatient, outpatient settings, prisons, hospitals, treatment centers, community care, all of what you've mentioned. But what did those big systems teach you about what's working in mental health and what's broken?
Sure. So what's working in mental health is relationships. It's always important to have a relationship with your patient, and that's pretty obvious, but relationships and being skilled in building relationships with a lot of different types of people, different cultures, different ages is always a really important thing from a clinician. And it was something that once I've gotten attuned on how to do it, has served me well throughout my career. So that's always there. Trauma care, as I mentioned earlier, is really valuable. You're always going to run into people with trauma. It's always going to be present in the setting. And even if it's not big T type of trauma, we're talking about the impacts of our upbringing very often in therapy. And so understanding how people experience things when they're young and how that creates the kind of personality we experience later in life is really valuable.
Well, you talked about these kids in the sweat lodge and shedding layers. I want to reflect on you for a moment. So, if we strip away the credentials and the business side of your practice, what's your personal why for still doing what you do after now 2 decades?
Yeah, going back to the sweat lodge, those guys had an art to it. And so it's always art to me to be able to come in, have a patient come into therapy, to have them come in and be a blank slate or a lightly worked on slate in some kind of way, and then help them create tools for themselves to paint a picture or to create a life that they want to have is always a beautiful thing and something I'm always honored to be a part of.
Well, I want to jump in the Wayback Time machine with you and go back for maybe some of our listeners are thinking about going into behavioral health as a career. Could you paint a picture of your first day providing therapy in a prison or secure facility? What was that like?
Yeah, so it has a lot of probably really predictable feelings. When you're walking into a prison setting, the setting itself is intense. You're gonna walk behind the walls, you're gonna see the gates, you're gonna see the fence, you're gonna see the guys in their outfits. And that could be a little intense and it can be a little unnerving and take you off kilter a little bit. You have to ground and that's your purpose. I'm there to help. I'm there to serve. I'm there to help people build strength, and that's always there, and always help me center back into what I'm trying to do, regardless of the intensity of it all.
And I know now you work with a variety of people, but I want to take maybe a moment to reflect on your time working with incarcerated people. What did that teach you, whether it's about trauma, responsibility, shame, or more importantly, resilience that you might never have learned in a typical outpatient office?
So I think I learned a lot about trauma, ongoing, obviously. Being in a prison is a mental health issue. It is a traumatic event just to live there and to watch people have to come in and adjust their lives to a prison economy or prison population and who they're engaging with is trauma in action. And so getting to watch trauma behaviors set up and play out and how people respond to that type of setting, helps you get a ton of insight into that. I'm always amazed at the amount of guys that stay connected with the families and people in the outside world and how important that is to them, even if they're in behind the walls for many, many years. That helps them stay grounded, helps them stay, looking forward. And ultimately, these are people that get given up on a lot. And to be able to go in there and know that I can add strength to their lives in some kind of way, bring value to them moving forward, um, it is a super empowering thing. If I can do it with them, I can do that with anybody.
Well, I want to make that real a little bit for our audience, Chase, without sharing anything identifiable, of course. Could you tell us about a particularly challenging case from your prison or maybe also from your hospital work? What made it so hard? Um, could you share with us maybe a story about that?
Absolutely. I always go back to one of my earlier cases in residential treatment. I was working with a 20-year-old young man who was going to age out of services. And what that means is when he was going to hit the age 21, his funding for the residential treatment was going to be gone. And he was a super likable young man, had a lot going, but he was an autistic kiddo. And, he was going to be the type that if he went out into the world, it was going to have real challenges. He didn't have a home to go home to. He didn't have a placement to go to when he was adult, and if he was gonna hit age 21, he was gonna end up homeless and probably somebody that was gonna be victimized. He was that type of person, and so it was sad every day to come in and work with this kiddo and know that he was staring at this and know that I was not really able to impact that. And so, learning the tough lesson that I have to be proud of what I am putting in and helping people where I can help people and I can add strength to their world just by being myself is something I had to learn in tough situations. You can control what you can control and you have to let go of the rest. Ultimately, on the last day, he he got the funding to come through and he was able to move into a group home. And to my knowledge, he's living a great life because of that. But there's been plenty of situations where I've been up against patients or situations where I can't control things. And that can get frustrating for a clinician. And I've had to always just kind of center myself and that I'm doing good work and what I'm adding is going to give somebody value somewhere.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's both a aspect as a clinician, but also just plainly as a human being. Um, well, let's talk about the flip side for a minute on a positive note. Can you share, and by the way, that is a positive outcome, right? So that's a wonderful outcome. Could you share a moment maybe from those settings that sticks with you as, frankly, this is why I do this, whether it's a turnaround, a small breakthrough, or a human moment that felt, pardon the phrase, like holy, like, wow, this is earth shattering for me as a human being. This is why I do this. Do you have any of those stories you could share with us?
Yeah. some of the treatment centers I worked with have had kiddos or parents that have worked and lived local to me. And so there'd be times where I would see them out at a Walmart or a Waffle House or a restaurant, and seeing these people out 5, 10 years later, and they're all like, Mr. Chase. And they want to come up and tell me about their lives and the journeys they've gone on since. They want to show me their cars that they've bought. They want to tell me about the girlfriend they got. These are super cool things. And then to know that you help them lay the groundwork in some kind of way that they still want to kind of bring that back to you is that's powerful.
Well, that's great. Well, let's talk a little bit about how your experience in these high acuity environments show up now in the way you work with high performing individuals, parents, couples, and professionals through undefeated healthcare. How does that experience show up now for you?
Well, I think the big thing is, working with complex cases translates. These individuals that were coming into inpatient units or in the prisons, they really complex lives, really complex mental health, really complex trauma. And that transitions well to the high performer. They have complex lives, big, serious jobs, big, serious relationships, powerful dynamics, really a lot of environmental pressures going on. And that translates well to working with that population and understanding the pressure that people feel in their worlds. The second thing is all the trauma work you do. Whether a high performer's got trauma or not, they're still experiencing, stuff from their upbringing or stuff from trauma that they've lived that's impacting them now and being able to see that. Oftentimes, the high performer masks a lot of that. They have such high developed strategies for how to manage their world, their job, their families, that the trauma work is not, the trauma issues are not really upfront as it might be with other people, but it's still there. And being able to see that and understand that these people still are, suffering and challenged in some kind of way is really useful.
Well, your website and public profile talk about this with high performing clients. People are used to figuring things out alone, especially around men's issues, parenting, and relationships. For a moment, could you just share with us, what is that typical, if I can use the term, undefeated client in your mind? Who is that?
It's somebody is feeling stuck. A lot of people come into therapy and they know where they want to go and they know where they're at and they don't know how to bridge the gap to that. And that's who Undefeated is there for. It's for people that are stuck. Um, they want to get better, they want to grow, they want to heal, they want to perform optimally wherever they're at, and they don't know how to get to the places they want to go, and they don't know really understand what's blocking them. They know there is a block, but they don't know how to break through.
Well, let's imagine maybe for somebody listening to this podcast, maybe they are an individual or a couple that's listening right now and they are stuck, right? They're in the same fight on repeat type of life mechanics. What would you say to them about what's possible in couples therapy and importantly maybe what isn't?
So I often work with couples that are in that kind of repeat, rinse and repeat cycle with their arguments and their conflict. And I think that that's a valuable place for couples to kind of take data. You know, when we bring things that are predictable into an argument or into conflict and how we handle the conflict is predictable, we can look at that as a data set. We can kind of mine what we're bringing in and how we're reacting within and look at these things that are habits, our programs, and then ultimately make changes to be a variable and understand that it doesn't take two people always to make a change. It takes just individuals doing their part within a dynamic and looking at what they're bringing in uh, that might help the situation.
You mentioned a word there and I want to just pick at it for a moment. You mentioned the word program. Could you describe for our audience what program means as you've used it?
Sure. Program refers to your subconscious. If your subconscious is where your habit loops live, these are things like walking, talking, eating, but they're also emotional habits. They're kind of the lens that we view our world through, kind of sometimes the intrusive thoughts that we experience. And ultimately, they're the habits of kind of how we play the game of life. And so Some people have maladaptive things around conflict or vulnerability or how they're feeling about themselves. And so identifying them as a program because we're not thinking about them actively and they're kind of like a computer program in that we're not actively, kind of running out all the code. We're pulling up and running a whole habit loop together.
Interesting. So you write about, these programs and habit loops. I want to kind of dive into a couple of other elements where that could be useful. We talked about couples, and I appreciate your insight there. You also, though, write about the mental load of fatherhood and parenting. And for parents listening right now who are maybe they're burnt out, the result is they're snapping at their kids. Is there a reframe or a practice that maybe you could arm them with that they could try this week to have some immediate improvement in their relationship? Not to put you on the spot.
No, no, it's okay. Something that parents can do, or couples or anybody, it is use time and space in a structured way. A lot of people think they're using time and space when they're taking off and leaving or slamming doors, and using it in a structured way so everybody involved knows how time and space is getting used, when it's going to end, and how we're going to work together. Is a super valuable tool to help kind of keep the volume down on conflict if it's there.
And you talk a lot about trauma. You've used that word a number of times here in our conversation. I want to maybe pivot that into a relationship sense. Your content on betrayal trauma, gaslighting, and also trauma bonds is pretty direct, but it's also hopeful. I encourage our audience to go read that, some of that content. There's a lot of great things out there in your public profile, your website. How do you walk that line between naming a hard truth and still offering hope as it relates to these issues of trauma, gaslighting, and trauma bonds?
Yeah, it's a tough thing. I mean, that's a tough place for a lot of people to be in their relationships, and I appreciate you mentioning the website there. But truth and grounding on the truth is an important thing for people, and if they're gonna heal, a lot of times we don't realize that we're bringing bias into our relationships. And what that bias is again those programs. We are raised in a certain way, we're taught in a certain way, and so we experience our world as normal, and we don't know it any different. And we don't know that that normal is full of a lot of bias. And so being somebody that brings truth and helps people ground in that truth, helps them check their bias, helps them open up to see their blind spots, and ultimately opens them up to the vulnerability to be able to see and hear those things from their partners or their family members or employees.
Okay, and you've got folks who are listening right now, and maybe there's somebody who's, let's say, on the fence. They have thought about therapy. Maybe it's intimidating. Maybe they're struggling or grappling with how to engage that. Maybe they're just not familiar with the therapeutic process. For somebody that's considering reaching out to you, could you describe what maybe the first, let's say, 30 to 60 days of therapy usually look like?
Absolutely. First 30 to 60 days is getting educated and building mindfulness. It's getting on the same page with your therapist on the tools you're going to get taught, getting taught those tools, and then starting to create mindfulness. Mindfulness around the habits and those program loops that I've talked about, and being able to start tracking and paying attention to what you're running on yourself so you know when that's showing up. What's not gonna happen is probably, all the immediate change that we hope to have, but really you're gonna gain more insight into what am I doing, and you're gonna feel a little bit more grounded in knowing that you're running things on yourself versus to yourself.
Yeah, let's talk about that. So, if I'm hearing you right, there is an understanding of programs. There's an understanding that some of these things are running in the background in the subconscious. I have to imagine that that could, bring up some very interesting feelings. Are there typically sort of big aha moments in therapy? Is it a graduated sense of mindfulness and awareness. But could you help us understand a little bit more about what somebody might experience in that process?
Yeah, so the exciting ahas kind of come when we're connecting kind of what we are identifying we're running on ourselves with where it comes from, and doing that self compassion, self empathy work to be able to draw a line to how I'm looking at the world and truly understanding how I got it, whether that's trauma that I've gone through, whether that's parenting I've been around, or the way I was treated, or the way I engaged in certain different situations. Those skills that you pick up implicitly or directly, when people connect that dots, it helps them really feel better about themselves. They have an understanding of, why I am this way. And I think that feels good to a lot of people. But ultimately, the progress often isn't like a light switch. It's people starting to use tools. It's people starting to try out new coping skills. It's people trying to figure out new words and try out new ways to interact with people, and then bringing in data on what's working and what they're struggling with and what's getting in the way of them actually, being more fluent in those tools.
Hmm. Well, that sounds compelling. I know a lot of people who are listening, maybe they're not in therapy yet, right? There are a lot of folks who have not had any exposure with therapy. So maybe for our audience, from your vantage point, could you share maybe in your mind the three or four most important things to look for when choosing a therapist? Beyond just who takes my insurance, right? What should they really be looking for when choosing a therapist?
Yeah, there's no real rule book out there on how to find your therapist, and there probably should be. But the big thing for me is relationship. People can have a lot of training, people can offer a lot of different tools, but if you can't build a relationship with the people you're working with, you're not going to get to any of those things. So, finding somebody that you connect with and almost admire, you want to believe that that person you're working with has tools and skills that are going to bring you what you need. And if that's not there, it's probably not a good fit. Then you got the training piece, which is really important. You want to be able to ask your provider, do you have experience working with this? What kind of training do you have working with people like me? And feel good in the answers you're getting in that. And then lastly, like a demographic kind of mix. And some people like working with people with certain genders, ages, and those kinds of things, and other kind of socioeconomic type background things. And that's really important to some people to feel safe and come in and do the work.
Hmm. What about the other side of that equation? Are there a few, let's say, red flags or signs that a therapist or practice might not be a good fit for you?
I think if you're feeling 2, 3, 4 sessions and maybe not after the first one, but like after a couple of sessions, that your therapist doesn't get you. Your therapist should be good at empathizing, should be good at like really building that inner understanding of what we're working with here. And if you don't feel like your therapist gets you after a couple of sessions and gets what you want out of those sessions, that's a real problem and you should look to make change.
Well, let's flash forward then, maybe a little further down the line. Let's say somebody's 3 or 4 months in. How do you evaluate whether the work that you're doing is actually helping you in a sustainable way?
Sure. So in the beginning of therapy, we're always going to set goals that we're always going to align together on what the patient's goals are, what they want to get out of therapy. And then we're going to refer back to that as we go along. That's going to be our benchmark to know if the interventions we're putting in place, the things the patient's working on, the resistance that we're working through is helping them get to the goals that we want to work on. But ultimately, feeling a lot more ease in interactions, using coping skills more fluently, and experiencing more vulnerability in relationships. And then probably having a lot more empathy when you're interacting with other people if you really, really work in the therapy process for 3 or 4 months.
What signs do you invite clients to look out for as to whether or not the work is actually helping? Like, you mentioned a few things here, but are there signs that you invite them to look for to really evaluate whether this is working or not?
I think looking at outside feedback, we're always going to bring bias. We're always going to think we have done things like this. We are, you know, we're doing the work, and we're always not attuned to ourselves. So if you're getting feedback from other people, that's a really valuable thing. And then just trying to be as measurable and objective as possible with people to be able to look at the data to see a change is really happening.
Well, maybe there's a listener out there right now who is about to press pause and ask, you know, themselves a question to gauge whether they're stuck, to use the term you used earlier, and whether or not they would benefit from therapy. If they were going to press pause and say, "Hey, could I really benefit from therapy?" What one question would you have them ask of themselves to determine whether they're stuck enough to benefit from therapy?
That's a great question, and something I talk about early on with patients and therapy. The question is pretty simple, where are you doing, feeling, thinking something that isn't awesome, that you don't like? And if you know there's a better option out there than what you're doing, and you're having a hard time getting from point A to point B, you're right for therapy. So it's like when you're stuck, and if you know there's a better option and you can't bridge the gap, therapy is good for you then.
Great. Well, I hope that's helpful for somebody out there that's listening. I want to shift focus, Chase, to Undefeated Healthcare. This is a practice that you have founded. When you decided to found Undefeated Healthcare, what was the problem in the system that you were trying to solve for couples, parents, and individuals? What led you to say, "Hey, I should create a practice around this that's differentiated, that offers something different?" Tell us about that process and what was in your mind when you were doing that.
So working in my time in institutions, I found that I brought a valuable voice, and I really feel like there's a gap in a hole, almost a vacuum in the mental health world related to men's voices. We need lots of different types of leaders to work with people in mental health. But I feel like I bring a voice that's unique as a man and the way I lead into that space. And a lot of people find that valuable and useful. And frankly, it's not very common in our world anymore to be able to come in and experience that. So I was feeling like there was a void. I was feeling like I could lead from there. And that's why I launched Undefeated Healthcare.
Well, that's great. I had a past guest who was telling me some surprising statistics about how few men are coming through the training and clinical development process to become therapists. So, it's not lost on me how much of a challenge that is in our behavioral health system. So, Chase, I want to take a minute and just talk about this shift from being a clinician to being a founder of a practice. And if you could just reflect back for a minute, what surprised you the most when you shifted from being a clinician in these large systems that you talked about to being a founder of a practice, responsible for brand and operations and outcomes, of course, at Undefeated Healthcare.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of little things that you have to be responsible for when you're a leader. You're all it's all the data, it's all the dots connecting, it's being all the glue between the people you're working with and the tasks. And ultimately there was a lot of things I had to get educated on very quickly in terms of medical billing, credentialing, marketing, brand building that I wasn't aware of. I'd been a big operations guy and I excel in that area, but I've really learned a lot and grown a lot in all those other areas. And ultimately that's been fun for me.
Well, just a quick moment to reflect on something you said a few minutes ago as being a leader, a male leader in this space. Um, for listeners, finding a good couples or family therapist can be challenging. And I'm curious for our listeners, what percentage of your practice and the reach outs to you and your practice come from women versus men?
Sure. I want to speak to something that you said earlier quick. I've become aware that only about 5% of the graduating class of new therapists are going to be men. And so that really shows that vacuum that you're speaking to in terms of the data. Maybe that was what we're talking about.
Hmm.
But in terms of, um, you know, who's reaching out to me, it is predominantly women. I would say 60, maybe 70% of the people that can reach out are women. They're women that are connected to men, men that maybe don't feel comfortable themselves or have some kind of old second shift related ideology as to who should be reaching out. But a lot of times it's women that are connected to men that are challenging or tough or resistant.
Well, you're I appreciate that context, right? Because I think it's important for people to have an understanding of, who is reaching out to somebody like yourself for help. Your practice, by the way, as I understand it, is licensed in West Virginia, Virginia, and Maryland. And I know you lean heavily on telehealth. So, could you talk a little bit about what you've learned about delivering deep work through a screen, right? And how has that changed your business model? And then I'd like to come back for how effective that is with couples and family counseling.
Sure. So working through a screen, you really have to evaluate things differently. There's some things that when somebody's coming into an office, you really can control, and there's a lot on the other side of that screen that you can't. You can't control internet. You can't control what's going on in the background in their worlds, and so really teaching people how to use telehealth is a valuable thing for a therapist. You got to teach them how to do that. You got to teach them how to get their value for the service. And so that's something I kind of do up front. It's a little level setting. The people that treat telehealth like they're still going to the doctor are going to be the people that get the most out of it.
That's helpful. I want to talk a little bit about strength based training, if I can pivot to that for a minute. You've got to practice undefeated healthcare. It's in the name, right? Undefeated. You've talked about strength based training and resilience. These are not just buzzwords. I'm assuming, right, from all of the things that I've read and researching for this episode, that this is really a core of who you are and what you and your practice are bringing to the behavioral health marketplace. Could you talk a little bit about this concept of strength based training and how you build resilience for clients?
Absolutely. Yeah, I believe anybody can build strength and it doesn't it have to be somebody going out and doing a bunch of new behavior to do it. A lot of times it's opening up your capacity to see the strength you already have, being able to recognize yourself, your own internal greatness, and your own abundance in that greatness is really the first step of it. And when you get more attuned to yourself creating good things, you're able to do more of it. You're able to have an easier time with that yourself moving forward.
Well, you mentioned earlier in our conversation a lot about high performing individuals. And I know that there are a lot of folks that listen to this podcast. They're high performers often because they are headed into the healthcare space or they're in the healthcare space now, or maybe they're in private equity and looking to buy a healthcare practice. So our audience tends to be a bit more of a high performing one. I'd love to understand what that looks like from a strength based perspective. So, sort of maybe to tee the question up this way, if you're a high performer who's sitting on the edge and listening to this and saying, gosh, my professional life is going really well, but maybe my home life is struggling, what might you say to that individual to encourage them to get help and really tap into the resilience and strength building you're talking about?
Absolutely. So I work with a lot of these people that are super successful in a lot of places. And I think the biggest challenge for these folks is that realizing that the skills that they learn and become super successful with maybe in their work life are not the same skills that they're going to be able to use at home. You know, their professional self and their partner self, if you run like a professional at home, you're going to have all kinds of conflict. You're going to have all kinds of issues and you're going to drive people nuts a lot of the time. And so developing those different versions of yourself that can be more compassionate, that can be more flexible, that can be more resilient, can allow you to have more balance to be able to function well in all kinds of settings.
And what do you think? How's that typically represent in how people engage you in undefeated healthcare? Is that individuals reaching out? Is it maybe one person reaching out, encouraging or looking for a way to engage their partner in this dialogue? For example, couples or family therapy, right? Um, could it be any of the above? What are you seeing, and what does that typically look like? If I can use the word typical for you.
Sure. So I think typically for the high functioner, you got people, couples, family members that have a lot of strengths in certain areas. They might be leaders of an organization or really killing it in a professional aspect. And they've got things in their home that they're having a hard time getting together. They're feeling overwhelmed. They're not feeling balanced. And a lot of times the issue or the behaviors that they're seeing either in their partner or in their kiddos are a result of some kind of dysfunction that they're experiencing in the world. And so, again, it's helping people build out those new skills, helping people bring in strengths, helping people trust themselves more, and to look at these habits that may be getting in the way.
Mhm. And maybe somebody is hiding that, in their professional life. Maybe they're just trying to, consult ChatGPT to look for advice. I've read a lot of challenging stories around that. And while we're on the topic, I know that AI is a big change wave right now. So maybe speaking to therapy and to a practice like yourself, where are you finding AI helpful?
Yeah, AI is it's still developing, and certainly people are out there using it to be their therapist, and that can be a little scary. But we're finding it helpful from an organizational standpoint in terms of organizing our clinicians, helping them do their data collection and ultimately documentation a little bit quicker, and then for a lot of organizational tasks within what we're trying to do and build.
Mhm. And so going back to the challenges, maybe, where do you draw the line? Where would you draw the line in how you involve AI in your practice?
Any boundary for me really has to come around patient privacy. That therapy session is sacred. It's supposed to be a confidential space, and that's why the magic happens there is because people are trusting you as a clinician to be able to hold sacred stuff that's really tough for them. And when you're inviting AI or other types of electronics to come into a session with you, everything you add opens up the risk of breaking that confidentiality. So you have to be careful with that, and that's something that we take very serious.
Mhm. And I've also read recently that AI queries and those kinds of things become part of a record. People can look back into search history and other things. So I have to imagine that there's all kinds of potential privacy issues there. Um, so for those that are listening, I'd say maybe be careful a little bit around those things when you're looking into AI as being a panacea. Yeah. Yeah, share more maybe around what you see there.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of patients coming in and they're using AI as a reflection tool or some kind of therapist or using some of the chatbots. And I think it's really concerning. I mean, I think there's opportunities there for sure, but it's also really concerning that people are uneducated in using AI and they're just getting thrown out there to it. And they're really leaning into it and trusting it. And that can be scary because they're uneducated in using a tool. That'd be like me, trying to go out and use like a drill and not knowing how to use it. It could have a lot of really bad consequences.
Well, I know, there are also, medical and behavioral health practitioners who listen to this show, and maybe they wanna experiment with AI tools for, in the operations space, as an example, like you mentioned earlier, whether that's documentation or intake. what guardrails would you insist, and do you insist in your practice that they put in place?
As I mentioned earlier, the guardrails you want to have around AI are related to privacy. Um, you want to continue to make sure that any tool that you're coming in is going to be HIPAA compliant, going to protect all your private health information, and going to help continue to create a confidential space, a secure space. Yeah, there's lots of tools, but you want to create security for your patients. And if that tool is adding to that, it's really not what therapy's about.
Well, I want to talk to maybe the next generation here for a minute, Chase. Let's talk to maybe the grad students and early career therapists who are in our audience right now. When you think about the world that they're entering into, and what's coming for them in this career space, how would you coach them to talk with clients about fit, goals, and progress without it feeling awkward for the client or for them?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of therapy that is inherently awkward for people because it's uncomfortable. We're dealing with vulnerabilities here. And I would encourage new people to be upfront, get a lot of that stuff out in the intake session, who you are, what you're about, what you work well with. And if there's something that you don't that's outside of your skill range or your competencies or your scope of practice, to help people move forward into working with somebody else. That's what they're coming to you for. They want those recommendations, and so they would want to know upfront if you thought that you weren't a good fit to continue working with somebody.
Oh, that's great advice. Well, Chase, I know you've probably heard that we wrap up each of our shows with a lightning round. These are quick questions designed for quick answers. Are you ready for that?
Yes, sir. Let's do it.
Okay, what's one book that you recommend again and again, either for therapists building a practice or for clients doing deep personal work?
I recommend No Bad Parts by Dr. Richard Schwartz. I love the internal family systems model and helping people identify that the parts of them that they're struggling with actually have value in their world is a really powerful thing. It's a great book.
Great. I always love to get a new book recommendation. We'll put that on the list. Thank you.
No problem.
You have 60 seconds with an anxious parent before they walk into a hard conversation with their teenager. What is one grounding tool that you teach them?
I like to teach people something that I call the saliva reset. It's a grounding tool. There's a lot of data out there that when we get dysregulated or when our kids get dysregulated, our mouth produces less saliva and we get dry mouth. And you can reverse engineer that. And if you force your mouth to be creating saliva, I know it sounds a little bit weird by moving your tongue around in your mouth, it helps reset your brain. And you can't be dysregulated if you're creating the saliva in your mouth. And it's something you could do quietly without other people knowing and really quickly. And it's really pretty useful, actually.
That sounds like a great, a great advice for anybody who's going into public speaking, frankly. uh, well, what's one small, repeatable habit that has made the biggest difference in how your practice runs?
Sure, it's leaning into the strength that I find in others. I don't know everything, and I'm confident that when I bring people into my life that they're gonna, bring me strength in some kind of way. So I always stay open to that. There's a lot of great people out there that know a lot more than me, and that helps me become a better provider. So keep leaning into other people and don't think you know it all yourself.
Great. Well, what's one myth about therapy that you wish we could retire for good?
Yes, it's that you got to be broken to come in. People that use therapy services and the ideas in therapy can level up their life wherever they are. Even if things are going well, you can always level up and get better.
Well, that's great advice. What's something clients often say near the end of successful therapy that makes you think, yep, we did the work?
Yeah, those are cool moments when I think those moments to me are when people are doing the self reflection, when it's not a therapist kind of prompted thing, and they're able to talk about their journey, where they come through, insights they've got, and the skills they've assimilated. You know, they're feeling like they've done the work. And that's really what's most important, is that they're leaving that feeling that way.
Well, great. Let's say for the listener who feels like they're failing either as a partner or parent right now, could you give them one sentence to hold on to this week?
I think it's that everybody's powerful. Everybody's powerful to create the situation they want, and that nobody's a victim, and that you're able to go out and create more and better for yourself.
Well, that's great advice. Well, Chase Butala, thank you so much for coming on to the show and sharing your perspectives and thoughts with us. It's been a pleasure to have you. Thank you.
Kevin, thank you so much. I appreciate you.
All right. Have a good one, Chase. Thank you. If you liked today's episode, please like and subscribe, and most importantly, share this podcast with others you think may benefit from the doc secrets shared here today. Thanks for joining us on today's episode, and we'll see you next time.